For centuries, rumors have circulated about a hidden place deep inside the Vatican, a place where historians believe some of the most powerful documents in human history are stored: letters from emperors, secret diplomatic agreements between kingdoms, documents sealed in gold by medieval rulers, even the original records from the trial of Galileo. Behind thick walls and guarded corridors lies an archive so vast and mysterious that for hundreds of years almost no one outside the church was allowed to see what was inside. People have called it the most secret archive in the world, but the truth about what is actually stored there is far more fascinating than most conspiracy theories. Because buried beneath the Vatican is a historical treasure that contains over 1,000 years of human history. This is the story of the Vatican Secret Archives. Despite its mysterious name, the word secret originally had a very different meaning. The title referred not to hidden conspiracies, but to something private: documents belonging directly to the Pope and the government of the Catholic Church. For centuries, these records were meant only for the use of the Roman Pontiff and the administration of the Church, which governed a religious community that stretched across continents. Inside these archives were the official acts of the Holy See, diplomatic correspondence with kings and emperors, records of church councils, financial documents, and letters sent by rulers seeking the Pope's approval or intervention in political matters. Over time, the collection grew into something extraordinary, a massive historical archive reflecting the political, cultural, and religious history of Europe and much of the world. According to historical research, the archives were created to preserve all documents related to the governance of the Universal Church, serving primarily the Pope and the Roman Curia. But the story of these archives begins long before the Vatican itself became the center of the Catholic Church. In fact, the origins of the Church's record-keeping go all the way back to the earliest centuries of Christianity. From the beginning, Christian leaders understood that written records were essential. Oral tradition alone was not enough to preserve the teachings, decisions, and events that shaped the growing Church. As a result, bishops and early Christian communities began preserving letters, official decisions, records of martyrs, and documents related to the administration of the Christian community in Rome. These early collections eventually formed the foundation of what would become the archives of the Roman Church. However, much of this early documentation was tragically destroyed during periods of persecution. In the year 303, during the reign of the Roman Emperor Diocletian, authorities ordered the destruction of Christian writings, leading to the loss of countless historical records. Despite these losses, the Church continued preserving its documents, and over time the papal archives expanded dramatically. During the Middle Ages, however, the archives did not remain in a single place. Instead, they moved frequently, following the Pope as political instability forced the papal court to relocate again and again. Important records were stored in the Lateran Palace, in secure rooms near St. Peter's Basilica, and sometimes in other hidden locations across Rome. These constant movements made preservation difficult, and many documents were lost during wars, rebellions, and political conflicts that shook the city for centuries. One dramatic example occurred in 1084 when Rome was sacked during conflicts involving Norman forces, causing further destruction of valuable records. Yet even through chaos and war, fragments of the papal archives survived, including collections of letters written by influential popes such as Leo the Great and Gregory the Great. The archives faced another extraordinary challenge during one of the most dramatic crises in the history of the Catholic Church: the Great Western Schism. Beginning in the late 14th century, rival factions within the Church elected competing popes, each claiming to be the legitimate leader of Christianity. At one point, there were 3 different popes ruling simultaneously, each supported by different political powers across Europe. As these rival popes established their own administrations, they also created their own archives. One archive remained in Rome, another developed in Avignon in France, and yet another appeared under a rival papal administration elsewhere in Europe. For a time, the official records of the Church were divided across multiple locations, reflecting the deep political divisions of the era. Only after the schism ended and unity was restored were these scattered archives gradually reorganized and reunited. The modern Vatican Secret Archives began to take shape in the early 17th century under Pope Paul V. At the time, documents related to the governance of the Church were scattered across numerous offices and institutions. Paul V recognized that preserving these records required a centralized archive, and he initiated a major effort to gather documents from across the Roman Curia and bring them together in one location. Around 1612, the process of transferring materials into the new archive began, and rooms adjacent to the Vatican Library were chosen as the initial home for the collection. Over time, more and more documents were added as different offices of the Church sent their older records to the central archive. What began as a small nucleus of documents gradually evolved into one of the largest historical archives in existence. Inside the Vatican Secret Archives, historians have discovered an extraordinary range of historical materials. The collection contains thousands of volumes of papal letters known as bulls and briefs, which were official communications issued by the Pope. These documents were often sealed with lead or wax and addressed to rulers, bishops, or entire nations. Some series of registers contain thousands of volumes documenting the decisions and correspondence of the papacy over several centuries. One of the most important collections is the series of Vatican registers, which preserve copies of papal letters dating back to the Middle Ages and provide an invaluable source for understanding the political and religious history of medieval Europe. Among the many remarkable items stored within the archives are documents of extraordinary historical significance. Some manuscripts contain letters from medieval emperors written on purple parchment with gold ink, a rare and luxurious material reserved for the highest levels of imperial communication. The archives also preserve international treaties, diplomatic agreements, and documents bearing golden seals from European rulers. Historians consider some of these collections among the most valuable diplomatic records in the world, offering direct insight into the relationships between the papacy and powerful kingdoms across centuries. One of the most famous sets of documents preserved in the archives relates to the trial of Galileo Galilei in 1633. Galileo had supported the idea that the Earth moved around the sun, a theory that challenged traditional interpretations of Scripture at the time. His trial became one of the most famous confrontations between science and religious authority in history. The Vatican Archives preserve portions of the records connected to this trial, offering historians direct evidence of the debates and decisions that unfolded during this controversial moment. The archives themselves have also survived dramatic moments in history. One of the most extraordinary occurred during the early 19th century when Napoleon Bonaparte conquered Rome. Determined to gather the most important historical documents in Europe, Napoleon ordered the Vatican Archives to be transported to Paris. Thousands of crates filled with documents were shipped across the continent and stored in the Palais Soubise, where Napoleon planned to create a massive, central archive representing the history of the nations he had conquered. After Napoleon's defeat, most of the documents were eventually returned to Rome between 1815 and 1817, though some volumes remained in France and were never recovered. For centuries, access to the Vatican's secret archives remained extremely limited. Only a small number of scholars received special permission to consult the documents. Everything changed in 1880 when Pope Leo XIII made a historic decision that would transform historical research. Recognizing the enormous value of the archives for the study of history, he opened them to qualified scholars from around the world. This decision allowed historians to examine thousands of previously inaccessible documents, leading to a wave of new research and publications that reshaped our understanding of European and church history. Today, the Vatican Secret Archives stand as one of the greatest historical repositories on Earth. The collection contains documents covering more than a millennium of political, religious, and diplomatic history. Within its shelves are records that tell the story of kingdoms rising and falling, scientific discoveries challenging established beliefs, and a global religious institution navigating centuries of change. Far from being merely a collection of secret papers, the archives represent a vast historical memory of the Catholic Church and the world it helped shape. And even today, historians believe that among the millions of documents stored there, countless stories remain waiting to be discovered.